Today is a bit like MP's Christmas because I get to ask the journalists questions. So I'm going to ask Robert and Steve just to say a few words quickly, because these books that they've written are fantastic, but even since they were published, things feel even more sort of exciting in a positive way and scary in, I guess, a different way. And I thought that they might just pick out a couple of themes just to get us thinking. And then I've got 3 very simple questions for them. Simple questions for us to ask, probably more not simple to answer. So perhaps we could start with you. Just before I hand over to Robert, I just wanted to say how much his work locally in schools means to me as a constituency MP. As the borough leader next door, he came out and spoke at Highbury Fields School when we were reopening it following a refurbish. And I've always been really grateful for the work that Robert's done in promoting our local schools, particularly because he went to Highgate Wood, which is where my son went, but also because I think the whole story that he often talks about in his books as well, about being a Londoner, an Arsenal supporter, which is quite nice, but also just remaining in touch with people and trying to understand the place of Hornsey and Wood Green, which is wonderful to have somebody who knows it so well, who grew up locally, who cares about our schools, and even at a moment of really difficult personal trauma for him, was able to come and speak at Highbury Fields School. And I think that meant an awful lot to me, then as a borough leader, but also I know to the children, to give that vision that education can really take you places. So over to you for a few words, and then I'll introduce Steve.
It is wonderful to be here with all of you. As you just heard from Catherine, I went to Highgate Wood, and this was my library as a kid. I mean, it's just all come, it hasn't changed all that much, truthfully, and it's all come flooding back. And it, you know, and these institutions matter so much within communities, and you know, you've just heard that one of my passions is supporting state education. I set up this charity called Speakers for Schools, and if any of you are in schools and you know, want to use our services for work experience or for, you know, access to our amazing list of eminent speakers, you should do that. Because in terms of what may revive this country, education matters more than anything else. And that's why it's such, as I say, such a joy to be in an institution like this, which is all about spreading opportunity. And I think the only thing that I'll say at this stage, because in the end I think it's much better to leave as much time as possible for us to have a chat. So I've written 2 books recently, both came out last year. One is a work of fiction, it's a thriller set in the crash. And that was it wasn't a sort of random decision to set it in the crash. One of the reasons I said it in 2007-8 was because in terms of some of the really bad things that followed, you know, whether it's low growth, whether it's widening inequalities, whether it's that vote for Brexit, whether it's the kind of political chaos we've seen in Parliament more recently, many of the underlying causes go back to that disaster in 2007-8. And then I've written another book called Bust? And it is about trying to evaluate all those structural things that we need to fix if we are going to get back to the kind of country that, if I look around the room, I suspect many of you are broadly of my generation, and you will remember a time, and I certainly had this when I was growing up, when I had a sort of confident expectation that life was going to be better for the vast majority of us. And if you look around the country today and you talk to people, they don't feel that. They despair. You know, if they're lucky, they think things will stay the same. There is a poverty of ambition at the moment. And so one book about, the thriller is called The Crash. The sort of fiction political book is called Bust ? And what it's mostly about is trying to come up with the kind of bolder proposals that, frankly, you don't hear from politicians of either party at the moment, because there is a fear of radical change, and you might say just too much gloom, that we just have to make the best of what we've got. And so my sort of message at the moment is we've got to be more ambitious than that.
Thank you, Robert. Now, Steve is also a local author and has specialised in the damage that Brexit has done to the economy. We know that it's about a 4% shrinking of the economy. And in his books about the Prime Ministers we never had, he goes into some really interesting detail about all sorts of different ways that the economy and the UK could have gone, had different choices been made. But Steve, I wanted to ask you about something which we see very much here in Hornsey and Wood Green. If you catch the 41 bus from here to Tottenham Hale, each mile that you go, people's longevity drops. I think in Highgate Ward, which is the westernmost part of my constituency, good life expectancy up around, well into one's late 80s. But then obviously on the Wood Green east side, going towards Tottenham, many people in very poor health from the age of 50, and indeed passing from very preventable diseases often, much too early. And that's just one of the snapshots, which is health inequality. And in this area, Finsbury Park, obviously, Stroud Green Road, that area, many of my constituents really struggling. They will really like the fact that there's more money for the food bank as a result of our conference today. But how do we fix the fact that we've got such an unequal society and we have such a great snapshot of that in the London Borough of Haringey?
Okay, well, I'll speak and answer that for the next 2 hours, and then we can have a wider discussion. Just briefly, if you don't mind, I'll frame it through my most recent book, which is called Turning Points, from 1945 to Truss. And when I will answer that directly. When I started writing that book, I picked out what I thought were the 10 most sort of significant junctions from 45 to now, really. And the 45 Labour government, the Suez crisis, and so on, and explain the nature of the turning point and why Britain turned at these key moments. But the more I wrote about it, and this partly will answer Catherine's question, the more I realised Britain didn't turn at these turning points. It reached a turning point and failed to turn. The issues that erupted after Suez are issues around us now, Britain's place in the world. The quadrupling of oil in 1973, no lessons were learnt, even though North Sea oil poured in a few years later. Brexit, Catherine has mentioned, and in a way it raised questions that were raised by Suez, and so on. Quite often, Britain reaches a turning point and doesn't turn, which raises the question of whether now, when it looks as if, and this is very rare in British politics, we are on the edge of a Labour government winning from opposition. It's only happened in 64 and 1997. 45, Clem Attlee was Deputy Prime Minister. Are we reaching a turning point? And you highlighted one of the many, many challenges facing that government. And I suspect that will be part of our wider discussion. So I will just make an observation at this point from, I've been covering politics about the same time as Robert and writing columns on the Labour government of 97 and then the Cameron-Osborne era. And I think the key to making that assessment now, in other words, whether the government will be able to rise to the mountainous challenges, whether it's the inequality you've highlighted, the state of the NHS, they're all interconnected. Follow the policy trail. It's always very tempting to be diverted by character, by the soap opera. So, for example, the BBC, as well as The Guardian, fell for Cameron being this great modernising centrist, as he himself described himself. But if you followed the policy trail, the policies he was advocating were to the right of Margaret Thatcher And those were the ones that were implemented. In 97, when Tony Blair was going around saying, a new Britain, a young Britain, a Britain reborn, follow the policy trail, and it was famously cautious and incremental in 97. So Keir Starmer has got a biography out by Tom Baldwin, and it is fascinating, and it humanises a figure who is often not seen in that form. And it's important and moving and powerful. And in my view, largely irrelevant in terms of measuring what the government will be like. Follow the policy trail. What do we know about the policies, the scale of the ambition? And I think that will tell you whether we're on a turning point, which addresses your question and many others, at a point where I think the scale of crisis in the UK is greater than 79 and hugely challenging. What are the policies? I've just learned that from writing columns where it's very tempting to say, Keir's working class, that means he's going to be, it's great that he's risen from such a background. It doesn't provide too much of a clue, I think, as to what will happen this autumn, do you reckon? Whenever it's called. Nobody knows. Nobody knows.
So my question, Robert, is what do you feel the exogenous shocks might be? Because obviously you mention in the book, Bust, you talk a lot about energy policy, and yet none of us would have predicted what has happened to energy prices and the whole Ukraine and Russia question. What do you think we need to take account of as frontline politicians in that context? Because I think there have been some really difficult shocks for this government. Not that I want to give the government an easy explanation, but we can't have predicted what happened and the impact that's had on household incomes.
So you wanted 2 hours for inequality. So that what I think is there's a sort of overarching issue about the failures of government throughout the West when it comes to a category of event that traditionally people regarded as fairly low risk but are massively high impact. And we've had a whole series of those over the past 15, 16, 17 odd years. The first one was the financial crash, which some of us saw coming, but frankly within government and within the regulatory world, there was an enormous amount of naivety about it for a hell of a long time, and they only really started taking proper action when it was upon us and when, the worst recession since the 1930s was upon us. And the longer term impacts, particularly for this country in terms of low growth, as I said to you, have been very profound. I had naively thought that at that point you would get a recalibration of how we do government. And at that point, you would get government thinking very hard about how do you protect your people from these kinds of momentous, life-changing events. But I'm sad to say you didn't get either politicians or officials changing our approach. And so we then got, for example, COVID. Where, as we now know, we don't need, 100, 200, 300 million pound public inquiry to tell us this, the government and the NHS wasn't prepared properly, despite the fact there were plenty of scientists around the place warning us that we were going to face a very serious pandemic one of these days, and we had to build up resilience. But we didn't. Arguably, you can put leaving the European Union into the same basket because, we had a campaign, and it turns out neither side had a plan for what on earth we do, when we leave the European Union. And one of the reasons, again, we are in the mess we're in is we still haven't got clarity of thought, even from the believers in Brexit, about how you restructure the economy and government for this new world. We are very, very bad at preparing for, you can see the lights in the distance. You're pretty sure it's an oncoming train, but you pretend it's something that's not that and it's not going to hit you. Broadly, it is amazing how NATO got its act together in the wake of Putin's invasion. But right up until the day before, really serious people, both domestically and internationally, in positions of real authority within NATO, within government, were telling me they didn't think Putin was going to invade the day before, right? So there is a sort of an incredibly damaging, Macabre-ish approach, the idea that something will just turn up to bail us out. And so one of the things, again, I talk about in the book, is you just need to change the whole mentality of both officials and indeed of politicians, that you've got to take these risks far more seriously. You've got to be much more scientific about it. I'm going to now focus on something that I regard as a potentially really positive massive change to our way of life, although there are also significantly negative, potentially significantly negative consequences of all of this, which is artificial intelligence, which I've been totally obsessed with for the past year and a bit, we're right at the start of a really powerful industrial revolution. It's happening, right? The whole way that we work, the whole way that public services both are and will be organised is changing in a completely radical way. And I've talked about the problem of low growth. This does have the potential to massively increase output per person and our prosperity and our productivity. But if you look at the history of the last 25 years, it will need political leadership. Because if you simply leave the private sector to roll it out, what's going to happen is actually people are going to get poorer and all the benefits are going to accrue to a very small number of investors and owners. And so we need a national, in fact an international debate about how we manage what is, in my view, the most important industrial revolution we have seen, probably since the dawn of the electric age. So you have to go back a long way for there to be a technology as far-reaching and as important as this. But although you will get politicians paying lip service to it, none of us have heard a powerful, important speech from any leader about the costs and benefits of this incredible technology. So what we need is people to withdraw, as it were, from their obsession with, to use, I'm afraid, that terrible cliche, the woke wars, which is where so much politics is currently concentrated, and in my view is massive displacement activity, because there are these big issues out there. You mentioned climate change, we have a really trivial debate about climate change. And actually what we need to see is proper leadership.
Thank you. Great answer. Steve, last question from me, then it's over to all of you. My question is linked. How much do you think, and I will name it, we have reduced our green pledge by some amounts of billions. How much do you think what we are trying to do with that particular area, the Great British Energy Company, and redoing the grid and insulating homes, etc., is a lift and drop from the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US? And how far do you think that will go in tackling climate and maybe bringing in some of the good elements of AI and so on?
You see, well, this relates to my previous answer. Follow the policy trail. And as you know, the 28 billion, which is not a huge sum of money in the great scheme of things, became attractive to this very cautious leadership of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, partly because what Biden was doing in the United States was both popular when he pitched it at the election, it wasn't a problem, and was beginning to have an impact on the US economy when it was implemented. So that ambition has now been pared down because of the fear, which is partly understandable, because Labour tends to lose elections in Britain, not win them, of being unable to explain in an election how this money was going to be raised and paid for. And so my instinct at the time was, oh God, that if they're retreating on this, God help us when they get into power, when all the forces that make life very difficult for Labour governments will be in place, God knows what will happen. But at the same time, as you suggest, what they are proposing is still potentially quite radical. It would not have been done by Blair and Brown in '97. They would not have set up a publicly owned company. Now, how that affects the energy market, the degree to which it can be a driver of their still incredibly ambitious targets to decarbonise by 2030, we will have to wait and see. The company is there being dangled, its precise remit, its powers, its capacity to raise money will determine whether or not it's a success. I mean, I hugely hope it is a success, because I think at the essence of what Robert was saying, and your questions, both your questions to me, is about, can Keir Starmer develop a modern state that addresses these questions? And therefore, if the publicly owned company is a flop, you then get back to, the state can't do anything, let the markets rip, back to a sort of very right-wing message from the next Tory leadership. So these things are really important. So I am divided as to whether to think, oh God, it's depressing, it's retreat, 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 or to recognise that there is still a potentially exciting agenda in what's left. And I don't think we'll know until they get in.
We get in, we hope. Good. Now, who would like to ask a question? Because we're halfway through.
I absolutely agree with you that, in fact, the books I've done on prime ministers, one of the overwhelming themes is that to be successful in leadership, you have to be, to go to Robert School's thing, a teacher. You have to be a political teacher. You have to be able to explain why you are doing things in an accessible way to make sense of complicated policies. And that's not just an added extra if you're lucky enough to have that skill. I think you have to have that skill to be a successful leader. So, and of course, personality is important and compelling, and we're all going to be fascinated by the drama of politics. I compare it to Shakespeare all the time, completely hooked on the drama. I just meant in terms of measuring, if you're trying to make a judgment of what that government will be like, don't forget the policy, which is quite often the last thing analysed in the build-up to an election. And there's a lot out there now, as there was with Cameron and so on, and Blair in '97, more than you'd imagine. On the other point, very briefly, I think there is a right-left divide over this. It's about the degree to which, I think Robert called it political leadership, whether you leave it to the private sector to largely do, or whether it's part of a modern state, where we, as a country, own the benefits of the technological revolution, or whether it controls us. And I think there is a debate, actually, which is partly around right and left.
So on your point about whether we're all to blame rather than blaming leaders, I certainly do take the view, if you're one of those people who's complaining about how awful it is, then you've got to get involved. Yeah. And I just get fed up with people moaning, but then, this is not a sort of, could be Labour, could be Tory, could be Lib Dem, could be anything, right? But if you care about it, don't think that politics is about other people. Politics is about you and your lives. And I do worry about apathy. If you look in the States, and there's also a trend of this in this country too, there's a lot of polling among young people who are basically saying democracy doesn't matter. Right? That is really depressing. And democracies are fragile. Democracy is being rolled back all over the world. We had this period up until about 15 years ago where democracy was on the march, and now wherever you look, you can see signs of retreat. And you can see people who claim quite often to be populists, but frankly do not respect our democratic traditions. And we've got to be wary about it, and we've got to challenge it. This is not a moment to sit on the fence. And I mean, just on the other point, I think traditional left-right divides are not, they're not as applicable as they used to be, but there is still a difference between left and right. I don't think that the big issues we face, whether it's climate change, whether it's the industrial revolution, or a whole raft of other things, these are all still amenable to a left-right analysis. It is just that some of the prescriptions, some of the policies that one might adopt are just going to have to be very different from what the government might have done. I mean, just on your point about, because I think you can see this within this context. Actually, one of the reasons why you're right, Blair and Brown wouldn't have come up with this idea of state ownership to fix an energy problem was because that was in the wake of the great Thatcherite revolution, and then the whole pendulum of politics had shifted in that direction. The politics, the pendulum has swung back in a slightly more, in that sense, conventionally left-wing direction. And there is an argument that says that the faith that Blair and Brown put in regulators has been rather disappointed. And actually, this is not the kind of debate that's going to set the world on fire, because this stuff sounds tedious and technical. But whoever wins the next election is very much going to have to look at regulation, because it's failed in so many areas. You only have to smell our rivers to know how much it has failed. Anyway, we need other questions.
Yes, please.
I think so. In the sense that I do genuinely. I mean, you can argue that Labour could, in the round, be more ambitious. And one of the things that is, unsettling to me as a journalist, rather than as a citizen, but I can absolutely see why citizens would find this unsettling, is that it is very difficult to get a handle on what a Labour government, I say this with all due deference to you, but it is difficult to get a handle on what this Labour government will actually do. I have a degree of sympathy with that, because, on the evening of that night in December 2019, when we saw Boris Johnson sailing to a majority of 80, with Labour's share of the vote in the low 30s and the Tories, 42, 43%. At that point, it was perfectly rational, whoever you were, whether you were people like Steve and me, or indeed, the soon-to-be leader of the Labour Party, to assume that the job of getting back into government was going to be at least 10 years. And I think, we should just remember how astonishingly fast that shift to support for Labour has gone. And it slightly caught the party on the hop. They didn't think they would have to have a radical programme of change by this stage. Now, they've recruited lots of new people. They are working very hard on it. To get back to your fundamental point, I do think one of the things where there's a genuine deep conviction is in the territory of climate change. Some would argue that they made a mistake in dropping the 28 billion pledge as a sort of statement of intent. But underneath all of that, there is a raft of genuinely real and, radical's a tricky word, but important policy. And I don't think they're going to back away from it. But I wouldn't underestimate the scale of the challenge to get to net zero by 2030. And on the basis of what they've said they'll do so far, I probably wouldn't bet an enormous amount of money on them hitting that target. Partly because you have to do things that are extraordinarily difficult in our current planning system, like actually connecting renewable power to our homes. Now, they've got, for example, all sorts of big statements about reforming planning requirements for connecting up renewables. But in practice, this stuff is very difficult to do.
Yeah, just to take one step back very briefly, it is an almost unprecedented challenge what they're trying to do in terms of policy development, because if you compare it with Blair and New Labour, the last time Labour were on the edge of power, when he came in 1994, quite a lot of the policies that formed the 97 manifesto were in place. Social chapter, minimum wage, actually the pledge which he never met to have a referendum on electoral reform, which was kind of associated with his relation with Paddy, they were all there. Because of the decision to dump in full the 2019 manifesto, they are developing policy from a blank sheet of paper. And both Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, who are the key players, are new to policy development at this level. And they're not just having to do a quarter of a framed painting, as Blair and Brown had to do, the whole painting. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why it's quite hard to read what it will be like in power, because I think they themselves are not wholly sure what it's going to be like. But we have to hear what they say. That 2030 target is still in place. And the reason I go back to the Cameron-Osborne thing, once Osborne said our pledge, which he didn't meet, of course, to wipe out the deficit in a single term, that meant however cuddly Cameron and Osborne projected themselves as being, I love the NHS and all that kind of stuff, the real term spending cuts were driving that mission. Now, the 2030 mission is in place, and I think they will try very hard to meet it. I, like Robert, don't think they will, but that tells you something about what will happen, that it's in place. And clearly Ed Miliband will be in that job. I don't think, there might be some around Keir who want to dump him, but I don't think he will. So I think the drive will be there, but you are right to suggest there are going to be many powerful counter forces, which is why quite often Britain doesn't turn when it reaches a turning point, to go back to my original point.
And just finally, very small thing, the one thing I do know about Starmer is he is the toughest, most ruthless politician I have genuinely ever encountered. I may have doubts about what he will actually do in government, but there was a period where the Tories characterised him as Sir Softy or something. It was the stupidest characterisation that I'd ever heard. And it's one of the reasons why they have consistently underestimated him. So, if it's just about backbone, believe me, Keir Starmer, as I say, has more backbone probably than any politician I've come across.
Shall I go first and then Robert?
Steve, and then Robert can get onto his favourite theme of what growth.
Yeah, well, one of my favourite themes is narrative, so we could do both sides. I completely 100% agree that narrative is again, it's not an added extra. See, I think the problem with the 28 billion, they got it the wrong way round. There should have been one speech after another from Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. Look at what Joe Biden's doing in the United States. Look at the benefits. We're going to look at whether we can have them here. And that should have been the framing. And Ed Miliband and all the others say, going over to look at Biden and indeed what the EU are doing. And then saying, right, I think we have reached a consensus that this is a desirable thing to happen. How do we get there? We're consulting with business, with energy specialists, and they've come up, which is true actually. I'm told the reason Rachel Reeves said 28 billion is what one bunch of geniuses said 31 billion, and another said 25, so she split it and came up with 28. So, but we should have all seen them at work in discussion about how we too can get what America has had. And then it becomes a narrative that it all appears desirable and credible and coherent. Then you announce the detail of the policy, once you've framed an argument around it. I remember having a conversation once with Keir Starmer saying, you've got to explain why you are saying what you're saying. You don't just assert a policy, but explain why. And he kind of agreed and was very interested. I don't think he'd thought about it really, but that is the art of political teaching. And at times he's got a lot better about it, but I think that's an example of where the framing was all wrong. And we've seen what happened.
What to say about this? I mean, certainly narrative stories matter, and part of my concern for the Labour Party is I'm not 100% clear what their story is. It's also slightly my concern for the British people. One of the things that I am very, I said earlier about the fragility, talked earlier about the fragility of democracy. Inevitably, when you have a general election and you get a change of party, there are hopes raised that there will be a big change. And if there isn't a big change, if people still feel that they're lacking in hope, particularly when it comes to living standards or their schools or, most important of all at the moment, the critical state of both social care and the NHS, if things don't get better, my worry is that you get a sense of curse on everybody's house, and that is a climate in which extremism will or could flourish. It's quite a lot of naivety around the place about how great it is that right now this is an unusual country, and it is an unusual country, where there is not an extremist party that could take power. We are expecting in the European parliamentary elections the far right to do incredibly well later this year. Talk to any sort of person in the centre of French politics. At the moment, all the talk is of how Marine Le Pen is likely to be their next president. The rise of the AfD in Germany is a very significant concern. And so there's quite a lot of sort of comfort being taken that we've got a more or less recognisable, Tory party against a more or less recognisable Labour Party led by rather dull technocratic leaders. And this is supposed to be a source of comfort here. But it's only a source of comfort if whoever wins then does succeed in regenerating hope. I don't, in the end, think that the 28 billion decision, will be remotely decisive in that rather bigger project of restoring, hope and growth. I was slightly disappointed in a way that they felt the need to drop it, partly because it was a simple thing for people to understand. You could hang a whole series of slightly more complicated policies off it, and they had already made, in an economic sense, the very significant move, which is the significant economic move they made, was to say that the 28 billion would now be subject to the meeting the fiscal rules. We can talk another time about how mad the fiscal rules are, but they are the framework which gives some reassurance to investors. One of the reasons why Liz Truss's 5 weeks was such an economic catastrophe was because she drove a coach and horse through them. And so as soon as Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer said the 28 billion is now conditional on us, being able to reduce debt in 5 years' time, they sort of become economically irrelevant in the sense that the money was only going to be there if, other aspects of their fiscal plans and the growth rate meant that markets would believe that this was not profligate. So, as I say, they'd made the important economic shift, and I was slightly, therefore, disappointed that they were still anxious enough about a sort of Tory campaign about how they were going to blow up the economy. A sort of the media aspect of it sort of took them off course. But anyway, this is, Keir Starmer is not the first Labour leader in history to feel you just got to do whatever it takes to win, and that winning is everything. And I think we'd all have some sympathy with that view. Well, I mean, I think it's a really important point, and there are lots and lots of different issues at play there. One is, the reason people mostly worry about it is, we all want to be supported with decent public services in our retirement, and, the traditional worry is that if you haven't got a large enough workforce relative to the number of people required, you're not generating the tax revenues, and you and I, when we're in that home, won't get the services paid for by the younger generation. In practice, there are all sorts of reasons to be a bit more optimistic than that. I mean, one is, get back to AI, right? If I'm right about how AI is going to make anybody who's in the workforce massively more productive, so long as, again, you harness that productivity to generate the tax revenues to pay for people's decent retirement, there's a big opportunity there. Secondly, our debate is framed always in terms of headline GDP, right, as opposed to GDP per person. So one of the things that's really striking about the current debates is America's growing like gangbusters. Europe is an area, not just the UK, but more widely, Europe is, a basket case because growth in Europe, compared to America, over some period of time now, has been very lackluster. Actually, if you look at Europe as a whole on a per head basis, GDP, national income per capita, actually the trends over the last 15 years in Europe and the US are almost identical, right? And it is GDP per head that matters, because that pays our wages and that generates the taxes and that determines the living standards that we need. I have, unfortunately, got one bit of slightly worse news for you, which is that is true of Europe as a whole. Unfortunately, it's one of the reasons I'm obsessed with growth in this book, Bust, is I'm afraid GDP per capita in the UK has, to use a technical term, been shit. And so we are a European country which does have a growth problem, both at the level of overall GDP and per capita, and that's why, in the end, the challenge of generating growth is so important.
Yeah, I don't know whether the implication... I do a weekly podcast, and it's quite interesting. There's this guy who's always emailing me, who's a climate change specialist, saying, "Steve, I'm not bothered about growth. I'm just bothered about sorting out climate change." But as we've discussed, actually, some of the ideas to address climate change could generate growth. And I just think, in the end, point to a government, especially a left-of-centre government, that has had the space to be progressive with no growth. I mean, so I actually think that Starmer's mission, although the objectives are very vague, to get high growth is a good one. It could have a sort of galvanizing impact on government, but I'd say the ends to that means is not that clear. But if you're implying, is there too much focus on economic growth because of climate change, point to a government where they've succeeded without it. So
it's carbon neutral growth we want. You've still got a problem of an ageing population. Let's be clear. An ageing population is expensive in all sorts of different ways, as we all know, in particular in terms of pressure on social care and the health service. So, you've still got to have people in productive work generating the tax revenues to pay for a health service, for example.
One of the reasons why New Labour had space in after their 1997 win was basically the Tories imploded. And William Hague would be the first to admit he was wholly unsuited for leadership, aged about 14 when he got it. And he said that many times. Now, it looks as if that was a relatively kind of civilized process compared with what might happen after the election. I think it partly depends on the result, the scale of the Labour win, assuming the win is going to happen. But it seems to me, with that party membership, you know, it's only going to go one way. It will be a battle on the right. It will, you know, the last few Tory leadership battles have been crazy. And I can't see it being anything other than like that. And, you know, there is an argument that this is the era for the populist right. You know, Trump will get in, someone like Suella Braverman or whoever will echo Trump here and be in power within 5 years, and the Labour government flops and we're in a Trumpian Britain. I doubt if it will work like that. I think there will be a kind of battle within the Tory party. There is still the kind of echoes of a one nation wing of that parliamentary party, which has to be managed as well. But it partly depends on the scale of the defeat, because who will be in that parliamentary party, but who will still be there is that membership. And it's a membership, you know, it's there. We're all half the age of the average Tory party member here today. And so, you know, they elected Boris Johnson, they elected Liz Truss, and so that's where they are, and that's where they will be after the election. And this Truss narrative and the Frost narrative, that it's all the fault, and the Rees-Mogg, you know, that Rishi Sunak's a socialist, and if only we had a proper Tory in, will be the sort of narrative. It's the sort of Benite argument after 79. You know, if only we had had a Labour government, we would have, but we had a Tories ruled, even though there was a Labour government. And they are now saying, Frost is saying, Brexit would have worked if it wasn't a load of Remainers in charge. Well, he was in charge of the negotiation. But so that is the kind of narrative they are framing now, a betrayal of the right, which I assume will be the driving theme post the election.
Yeah, I mean, I think a really interesting question is whether the Tory party can hold together. There was a moment in, where are we now? God, I lose track of time. There's been so much going on over the last few years. This would have been in sort of 2018, 2019, where if the Labour Party had, under Jeremy Corbyn, had agreed to Theresa May's Brexit, at that point, this would have been the equivalent of the Cornwalls reconfiguration of British politics, the end of the Whig Party, the gradual rise of the Liberals, the complete reconfiguration then of the Tory party. And the Tories at that point would have split. And actually, we might well have had Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. It was a big moment, and for a whole variety of reasons, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell didn't seize it. And perhaps have a long conversation about why they didn't do that on another occasion. Anyway, that said, really to Steve's point, the underlying schism in terms of the ideas, and dare I say it in the context of Tories, because they're not supposed to have ideology, but the new Tory party does have ideology. The underlying split in that party is still there, right? It was papered over by the fact that Theresa May was thrown out. We had the great blusterer Johnson in. We had the most basic of all Brexit deals. But within the Tory party, there is this huge difference of outlook between the One Nation Tories, the more traditional Tories, and those who are broadly Faragists. And that tension between the sort of little England fighting alone, 2 world wars and 1 World Cup, incredibly narrow view of politics, versus a rather broader, more humane approach. That tension is still there. And I think if Labour wins, there is a very good chance that the party will break up at that point, because there will be a battle for the soul of the party. You would sort of assume, unless the membership changes, that it will move to a sort of Tea Party populist right. You would sort of assume that, because one of the things that happened after Nigel Farage broke up the Brexit party and turned it into reform is quite a lot of members of that party did join the Tory party. And so the Tory membership is not completely. There are still traditional Tory members, but there aren't as many as there were. So it is going to be messy. On the other hand, it probably will also be a bit messy for Labour, in the sense that one of the things, and this may change over the next year, but one of the things I've done different jobs in my life, but I was a political editor back in the 90s. I was political editor for the Financial Times, and was really immersed as a journalist in the creation of New Labour. And in terms of just understanding it, and also spent a huge amount of time reporting on the mess that was the Tory party. And I don't know if you remember this, but there was an amazing sense, and this is not sort of projection from now, there was an amazing sense in May of 97 that the country wanted change, right? And there was enormous optimism. Now, whether or not that optimism was disappointed or fulfilled is a really important issue. But my God, there was a following wind behind Blair and Brown. And I remember, as a journalist on the FT, I was staggered, for example, that for the year after that election, even the Daily Mail refused to write a single negative story about Blair and Brown, because they had a sense that their readership wanted to give Labour the benefit of the doubt, right? And therefore, Blair and Brown had the most amazing honeymoon. I've never known a honeymoon really like it. Keir Starmer won't get that, right? Whatever, even if he wins a landslide, right? He won't get that. Partly because society is so much more fragmented, right? Daily Mail is still influential, but frankly, compared to the sort of power of social media, it's just not really in the same league. And social media is not suddenly going to decide not to start saying, not to say incredibly toxic, sometimes misleading, sometimes fictional things about every politician. So, whoever wins, it's going to feel complicated, and I think, the fundamental point is these are volatile times, and it's another reason why. I'm going to finish here, I think. Sorry, I've rambled a bit. But the thing that I haven't really said, but I think I really passionately believe, is that what matters is slightly different from what mattered in 97. In 97, it really, really, really mattered that Labour had a sort of coherent vision for what it was going to do. You could argue it was a bit timid, but it was able to generate a sense of both continuity and change, which people understood. I think now there is so much despair with the Tories that weirdly the sort of message and vision for Labour is less important in terms of winning the election. They've just, if they want to win, they've just got to... I do understand why he's cautious and why he's obsessed with not messing it up. But if he gets into power and he doesn't then have a project that everybody gets, then it will end in tears. And the reason for that is partly everybody in the country feeling they understand where they're going, but it's also Whitehall. What they should do, the one lesson they should learn from Blair and Brown is Blair and Brown got in, and actually, I slightly disagree with you on one thing, they actually delivered more than their manifesto said. On the day of the election victory, I was rung up by Brown and his people and told to go in and see them the next day because they were announcing they were giving control of interest rates to the Bank of England. This was the most important economic reform that this country had seen for decades, right? And there was palpable shock in the Treasury, because that's not the way we do things in this country. You sort of consult your officials and they give you feedback, and then over a period of 5 years, maybe you'll get some change. Actually, Blair, Brown and their advisors went in and just said, we're doing this, and we're doing it today. And they did it, and it worked. All right? And the point of that story is, at that point, everybody knew they were in charge. Right? And so what somehow your party needs to do between now and an election is to have some things like that to do, which says both to Whitehall and to the country that this is a government with a purpose. I mean, Cameron and Osborne, who are obsessed with Blair and Brown, totally got this. Now, many of us think that austerity was hugely damaging in terms of growth and prosperity. But politically, it was their project, their giving independence to the Bank of England, their tax credits project, their welfare reform project. It was simple, everybody understood it, and whatever we may now think about the damage that it did to public services, there is no question in my mind it won them the next election. Because they were able to say, this is what we've done, we've stuck to it. Okay, they didn't eliminate the debt, but they were able to point to some progress, and the economy was recovering at the same time. What any government needs is something clear and simple in that sense that gives you momentum and binds you together. And at the moment, the issue that I would have around Labour is I don't know what that is.
Absolutely. The governing project, which is always slightly different, though not wholly, from a winning project, must give the impression from day one of a sense of mission and a plan. The excitement around 97 was very unusual. A lot of governments are elected without that wave of excitement, which was partly a change of government for the first time in 18 years, as well as Blair's charisma, etc. A lot of governments, Thatcher in 79, there wasn't a wave of excitement. The Tories had been in 5 years earlier, but she had a plan. Cameron and Osborne had a plan that kind of sustains a government, and there must be that clear sense of purpose, or else you're thrown off course by the sheer impossibility of events like the Heath government, which was just pushed aside after 3.5 years. So that plan has to be thought through and has to be explained and has to be hailed from day one. And we've run out of time.
We have. Can we have a huge round of applause for our panellists?